Well, I don't know whether it's a vampire, but it was a monster that came into the room where I was sleeping. The monster bore an uncanny resemblance to a statue that was like in a square in this German place. But I thought it was real. I saw it walking and creeping along and scared the hell out of me. You know. Come to life. Horses and men on horses, dressed in crusader outfits, going through the woods with flags and swords. I mean, not just 2 or 3 horses and men. I'm talking about a whole cadre, 2 by 2 column going through. I don't know. This would have been something out of somebody's dreams or out of somebody's head. It didn't fit. It didn't fit because there were bombs and shots going off, and it was like a bizarre time. So I can't tell which was real and which was fantasy and which was pure fright. You know, bodies just kind of lying in the woods, dead. How they died, unclear. I imagine injuries from bombs or just being shot. Shot by who? It could have been the Germans, it could have been the Russians. You never really knew. It was very common for Germans to masquerade as Russian troops and for Russians to masquerade as Germans in Germany, to find out what people's allegiances were, especially people who clearly were displaced persons. And it was a constant game of trying to find out where your allegiance was. And if you came up with the wrong answers or you looked the wrong way, they'd shoot you. You'd be dead. You know, what's going on in the Ukraine today, some of it is very reminiscent of the things that I remember, 78, 80 years ago. And to think that so much time has passed, some of the same things are happening again. And you get these from snippets from the news. So you don't get the full picture, but every now and again they'll interview, some Ukrainians with English translations, and it's like, it's amazing. Almost 80 years later, same things are happening the same way. The Russian troops behaving the way that I remember my mom explaining to me how Russian troops behaved back then, from what I remember. So it's just amazing how 78, 80 years later, things really haven't changed all that much. And you never knew if you were going to live another hour, another day. You never knew if you were ever going to eat again. There was really no food. So whatever food you managed to scrape up, you saved. And you always left a little bit for the next day, because you never knew if the next day would bring you any food of any type. And, you run across different people who are living in the woods for different reasons, most of which really have to do with they have no place to go, and maybe they thought it's a safer place to be than wherever they were. And some of them were kind, and others were not. And others, would want to rob you from the little bit that you had. I told you that we were living in Augsburg in a basically a camp for displaced persons. It was like a quadrangle, and it was policed by Americans and the French and the English, from what I remember. Troops running around in a Jeep. And they were basically the enforcers, making sure that the displaced people were not being mistreated, by the locals. But they had very strict rules. And among one of the rules is that the displaced people were not allowed to have and raise any livestock. Why, I'm not sure, but that was one of the rules. I'm sure it was agreed to on an international basis. So as for instance, you couldn't have chickens, couldn't have pigs, couldn't have cows. But of course, Europeans being Europeans, we had them. And so we had areas where the cows roamed, we had areas where there were ducks and chickens and pigs, and somehow, miraculously, the communications channel from town to town would go across, and we knew when the raids were coming. And the raids were quick, and they were sudden. And before you knew it, soldiers would appear, and they would be searching outside, inside the house. And so there was a rush when word came through to hide the pigs and to hide the cows and chickens. I know this is hard to believe, but the buildings we were in, if I remember, they were like 4 stories, maybe 5 stories high in a quadrangular area. And the people that owned the livestock to preserve what they had would bring the livestock up through the stairs and get them up into the roof. I'm not exactly sure how they happened, but there'd be a trail of cows and pigs being hidden on a roof. And so when the soldiers came in to basically do their inspection, they didn't find them. Now, it would seem inconceivable that trained soldiers can't follow trails of animals and, the smell of animals. But as I get older, I think I finally realized that they just wanted to look the other way. And it was a rule they really didn't want to enforce, but they were going through the motions. And so every now and again, I couldn't tell you how often it happened, but there'd be a rush to hide the pigs and the cows, and they would be up on the roof. So for anybody who's watching this and you lived through it, you know what I'm talking about. I'm not making this up, it was real. But telling the story today, it sounds like, that's crazy. Nobody would do something like that. Oh yeah, they did, and and that's the way people survived. So I had a pet duck, and the way I treated the pet duck was I made a collar for it, and I would walk the duck around, the quadrangle area. Well, I didn't know it at the time, but the duck really wasn't meant to be my pet. It was being groomed to be dinner. Except I didn't know that. I was just a stupid kid. So, and my mother would feed the duck. I remember her taking flour and water and rolling this thing between her hands, and it would be like a little zeppelin, and she would feed the duck. So one day, I was out running around doing something, came back, couldn't find my duck. But I did find a whole bunch of people in the apartment where we lived sitting around a dinner table with napkins in their shirts. And I looked on top of the table, and there was this fine-looking something or other. And there had to be 8, 9 people around that table. And I, of course, sat down and, be polite and everything, following my mother's instructions to sit and eat. So I took a first bite of what she had carved up, and I didn't particularly like the taste of it. And then one of the stupid people at the table mentioned that it happened to be a duck. And it immediately dawned on me that it was my duck. And I remember jumping up and crying my eyes out and running away from the table and saying something awful, I think, to my mother. And she claimed that the duck choked on the food that she was feeding the duck with, but it became pretty obvious that, she killed the duck on purpose. And these people, these neighbors, were there to kind of enjoy the feast. So that's kind of what I remember about the duck. But times weren't always that good. And so almost immediately after the war, and I don't know exactly how immediately after the war it was, there were people living in the quadrangle areas for displaced people that were, I guess the kindest words I could think of, they helped the Germans during the war. They were collaborators, basically. And by that, I mean they gave the Germans information about other people, information that caused some people basically to never be seen again, other people to be tortured and beaten. And so there was a great deal of anger amongst the displaced people living in a displaced person's camp who knew who the collaborators were. And they were, distributed within a quadrangle area. And so I think the allies, basically to allow this pent-up anger to really get a release somehow and keep people from being murdered, decided that they were going to have a parade down the streets and around the quadrangle. And a parade consisted of both men and women with nooses around their necks. The women mostly with at least half their head shorn off or cut in the most disgusting way that you could think of. Men whose shirts were ripped, clearly beaten up. They're being paraded around the quadrangle area. And people would stand on the sidelines and jeer and shout and curse and throw things at these poor people. Most of them had their heads down. I don't think it was out of shame to have their heads down because they didn't really want to have their heads up. And so these people were being paraded around, and some people would basically run up to them and hit them over the head, either with their fist or with a stick or, anything they could grab that would give them extra strength to hurt somebody. And I think everybody felt better afterwards. I remember as a kid watching it, not feeling good about it at all. It was just horrible. I didn't know any of the people that were being paraded around. I had really no idea of what any one of them had done, discreetly, specifically. And they were paraded around several times. And you could see with each iteration, there was more and more blood, coming off of their heads and their shoulders and their arms. And it was pretty disgusting. And anyway, I think it took a lot of the pent-up anger away. Maybe even saved some lives, I don't know. But that's one of the things that really happened. It was sort of a parade of shame. I remember the nooses being around people's necks. It was pretty ugly. So the other piece I remember, and again, after the war, living in a displaced person's camp, individual skill sets became very, very important. No one really had a job per se. It's, whatever you could do. If you were a carpenter, you did carpentry work. If you were an electrician, I guess you did electrical work. I didn't know any electricians, but, my mom really was a great seamstress, a master seamstress, as it turned out. So one of the ways that she was able to feed us was by sewing stuff. And she was able to find this old sewing machine, which she brought into the apartment that we were in. And this apartment was shared by several other families. I don't want anybody to think that we had an apartment all to ourselves. I think in our apartment there might have been 4 or 5 families living there together, kind of sharing a kitchen area and stuff like that. Actually even sharing the same bed in some cases. But so she had this old sewing machine. And the problem with the sewing machine was that you couldn't find any sewing machine needles. And so she had to barter, and she finally got a needle for the sewing machine. It was a little rusty, but she managed to clean it. And my older brother Eddie, and I decided that based on what we were seeing from especially the American soldiers, a lot of them looked like and sounded like they were cowboys. I don't know how we drew that conclusion, and so I talked my brother into making a holster with a belt, because we wanted to look like cowboys. So I was going to make a holster with a belt. We didn't have guns, of course, but that's beside the point. We'd still walk around, making believe that we were cowboys. And so how was I going to make this holster and belt? Well, hell, I used Mom's sewing machine. I've never used a sewing machine before. And in the process of making the holster, I pushed the material underneath the needle to a point where I broke the needle. And I knew immediately that things were not going to go well. So our mom came home that day, somehow immediately found that the needle on the sewing machine had broken. And I think both my brother and I got the beating of our lives for that. A lot of crying, a lot of carrying on, like we were going to starve to death. How was she going to sew anything for anybody? Weren't any needles to be had. But of course, she was working in an American factory making uniforms for soldiers. So it wasn't too far of a stretch for her to find a needle or two that had gone astray in a shop. And she brought it home, and she was back in business again. But I remember my days of being a cowboy, my brother's days of trying to be a cowboy, didn't really work out too well. Nor did it when we got older and came to the States. And the other piece I remember is the German money, the marks. Everything had crashed. The economy in Germany had crashed. And the paper money that was being used was essentially play money. There were tons of it around, had absolutely no value. Couldn't use it to buy anything. And so we used it basically to play. And I don't know why I thought about the money other than the fact that, well, never mind, I'm not going to get into the politics of it. But I remember the first time I had ice cream. And it might have been around 1946, 1947. And I remember ice cream being served to me on a wax piece of paper. And it was a lump put on a wax piece of paper was ice cream. I had no idea what it was, but I remember it was an extraordinary color. It was kind of like an Easter color. It could have been green, it could have been pink, but whatever it was the most delicious thing I think I ever had. And so, and it came from a little push cart that either a German guy or a displaced person was moving around. Obviously, it had dry ice around it. And it was a great experience, and I was told everybody in America could eat this as much as they want every single day. And I said to myself, holy smokes, I want to go to America. So that was the first time that I really had thoughts about coming to America. Which reminds me about the first time I had Coca-Cola. It wasn't too far from the ice cream episode that one of the displaced persons who was working for an American airfield, some capacity, don't know what, brought home a bottle of Coca-Cola and opened up the bottle for me. I remember it wasn't a big bottle, but it was a bottle, sort of greenish, gray color, and offered it to me to drink. And I tasted it, and I immediately thought, oh my God, this is wonderful. Is this American too? And yes, it was. And so I had my first Coca-Cola, and that was around 1946, 1947. I don't think I had another Coca-Cola until I came to the States, but it was kind of an awakening period for me. In an attempt to get more Coca-Cola, in an attempt to get more ice cream, some of the other kids and I, who kind of lived in a displaced persons camp, decided that there was an American airfield nearby, actually within walking distance. Nearby is probably an exaggeration. We had to walk quite a bit. But we would stand in front of the airfield. We couldn't go in, but we would stand by the entrance. And the trick was to really get a forlorn look on our faces, like little waifs, standing by with their heads tilted down, waiting for the Americans to either walk in or walk out and kind of throw something at us that, they wanted to dispense with and show that they had a lot more than we did. And they were happy to do that. They were happy to oblige. And they would throw gum at us, and I remember dentine, and I remember other sticks of gum. Occasionally bars of chocolate would be thrown our way, and occasionally, a bottle of 7-Up or a Coca-Cola bottle would wind up our way, because they knew we were standing outside the gates, and they wanted to impress us kids. I think they figured out we weren't Germans. I think they figured out that we were displaced kids, and maybe they felt sorry for us. Or maybe not. And so we would come home with the stuff that we would accumulate, at the gates to the airfield. And we would do that, I think, just about every day. And it was kind of interesting. Some of the airmen would walk by and totally ignore us, and other airmen, it seems, would kind of go out of the way to try to be kind. But we appreciated it all. And so while we were at the camp, my mom had a particular gift, besides being a master seamstress. And that gift was telling people's fortunes. And I don't know if displaced persons were gullible or they wanted to believe in something. And so I think they chose to believe in something, and they chose to believe in the cards and what the cards told about their present and their future. They would come to my mother because my mother had a reputation, mostly self-created, I think, about how good she was at telling people's fortunes. And so we would have displaced people coming from near and far to have their cards read, by my mother. And every now and again, there'd be a fortunate soul in the audience who was told that they're due for a very long trip, a very exciting trip to a land of plenty. And I remember the expressions on their face. They would literally act out delirium, that they just won a lotto or something. And in their minds, they truly believed that they were going on a long trip. It was unclear exactly where they were going, but they were happy to go. And this went on actually for quite a while. And my mother as well believed in telling fortunes as well as being told her fortunes. And now, every now and again, my mother and I would wind up going into the woods in Germany. I don't remember how far it was, but it was a trek to the gypsies. And gypsies had their wagons, and my mother would have her fortune told. And in turn, she would bring them food. Where she got the food from, I'm not sure. I never really asked her. But there would be a sack of potatoes or a sack of pears mixed with apples. And that was basically the barter system that was used for the gypsies. And gypsies really didn't have anything really of any value other than their own families, extended families that, lived with them. I never felt threatened or afraid going to these gypsy wagons. But other people did when they found out, my mother would do and warned her, don't do that because they'll suck your blood. And so anyway, she would have her fortune told. And sure enough, the gypsies were very fond of telling my mother that she and I were due to go on this long, wonderful trip to a grand place. And I remember my mother feeling very excited at hearing the news that we were destined for a long trip and long adventure. I mentioned individual skills. People really didn't have jobs per se. At least the displaced person didn't. And so I remember the people living in our unit. There was an engineer. One was I was going to say a barber, but I don't think so. He did something else. Had a mechanic. And so those people would find day jobs or gigs, and that's how they would earn their money or earn food or drink. And in many cases, there was no money per se. It was basically the barter system, and that one went on right after the war for the first couple of years. German marks were useless. They had no value at all. But what did have value were goods and food that could be traded. And we had one guy who was especially adept at picking up spent cigarettes, usually brought around the airfield, where the soldiers would just flick the remaining cigarette off. And he would bring them all in, put them in a bag and bring them in and then cut them very delicately and take the tobacco and basically repackage everything. So I would watch cigarette making, and then he would basically resell them or barter them as if they were brand new cigarettes. And I think he had a little machine that he could stamp the paper with. Fake, forgery, of course. I don't know exactly what the logo had on it, but people thought there were cigarettes from America. And indirectly, they probably were, but I don't think anybody knew they had previously been used and abused and tossed. But I remember learning my lessons, watching all of this, and discovering that there was value in just about every piece of trash if you could repurpose it somehow and make it look new. I was born in Lithuania before the Russians bombed and we had to leave. And we wound up going through Poland and winding up in Germany, and we were arrested by the Germans and put into a camp. And from what I remember my mother telling me, it was Buchenwald. And it was a special section of the camp separated from the Jewish population. And the separation basically by barbed wires. And so we were political prisoners. It's a very large segment of political prisoners. And I don't remember much about those days except the barbed wire, very tall. And looking across the barbed wire at our neighbors, and hearing screams at night, not just one scream, but a lot of people screaming. And I remember seeing little kids, roughly my age, older, younger, across the barbed wire. But you wouldn't necessarily see the same faces all the time. You would get friendly, if that's a term I could use, with some of the kids. And after a while, you just wouldn't see them anymore. And you don't know if they moved. Well, in my mind, yeah, they moved. Chances are they really didn't move. So it was out of Buchenwald that we were finally taken and put out as the forced labor to Mrs. Miller. I kind of skipped over that part, I think, in one of the earlier segments. Had we stayed in Buchenwald, I don't know what would have happened, but I'll go back to the displaced persons camp. You know, as displaced people, we would get care packages from the United States. And I don't remember how often these packages came, but we would all look forward to it. And the packages would be filled with food, chocolate bars, but not the chocolate that most people think of. These were thick bars of chocolate, loaded with chocolate, inedible. And I think they were K rations that the Americans had that didn't really know what to do with, that they used to give to the soldiers. And so they decided, I think, to get rid of some of the chocolate bars that they had, you know, by putting them into to care packages. And they were much appreciated, don't get me wrong. But I remember occasionally there would be toys in these boxes, and I would really look forward to getting the toys. And not to play with. I had no desire to play with any of the toys that came in care packages. What I wanted them for was to take them apart. I wanted to see how they were made. That's really what interested me. So racing cars would come in, and they were mostly metal and die cast, and I would take them apart and just find out how the axles were, you know, placed onto the body of the vehicle. And there were these tops that you would take a plunger, and the top would spin around and make music. And I remember being fascinated by that. And it was the metal. And so the faster that you pushed the plunger down, the more musical sounds it would make. And I remember being absolutely astounded by this thing. So I took a couple apart, and I was never able to recreate them together again because they were made out of metal. But it really didn't matter. I kind of figured out how it worked, and that was really the fun. So toys were not for playing; they were for figuring out how things worked. And it was probably a good lesson for me, my adult life when I worked, because I enjoyed figuring out how things really worked. Other than that, it really wasn't for enjoyment. So maybe I missed a lot of my childhood in the sense that it really didn't have toys, but I don't really care. Maybe one of the saddest parts that I remember, trying to imitate being a cowboy or something else, and living in the quadrangle area, the displaced persons camp. Because the holster didn't work out all that well for me, I decided that I would make a slingshot for myself. I'd never had a slingshot before, but I was able to get some rubber bands. And so I fashioned this slingshot from some wood that I found in a quadrangle area. And one day, out the window, there's this tree and a bird in a tree. I can't tell you how far away it was, but so I decided I was going to do some target practice. And I don't remember what I used. Maybe it was a small stone. But the first shot that I took, I hit the bird. And the bird fell out of the tree. And I remember first being excited at the prospect that I had my first kill, until I actually got to the bird and looked at it. And I remember starting to cry because the bird was hurt, and I heard it. And I remember picking up the bird and bringing it back and finding a little, I guess it was like a shoebox. I put the bird in the shoebox, try to line it with something, make it more comfortable for the bird. Put some water in there and something that would retain the water so the bird would have something to drink. And waiting for it to recover. And the next day the box was gone. And my mother said, the bird flew away. I believed her. And later I realized the bird didn't fly away, the bird died. So my mother probably dumped it because she knew that I was kind of upset. And I never hunted ever in my life. I couldn't stand the thought of killing something that wasn't able to defend itself. And so I guess that first kill caused me not to ever want to hunt. I fished, but I never hunted. But to this day, the image of actually hitting the bird that I never thought I could possibly hit, stuck in my mind. In Buchenwald, I remember seeing faces, becoming familiar with the faces of the kids. Not the adults, but the kids. They were roughly my age, we could relate. Somehow we understood one another. Even though a lot of them, I think I spoke German at the time. I don't think I learned yet how to speak Lithuanian, but I did speak German because I had to learn how to speak German. And I think some of the kids on the other side of the fence also spoke German, but faces changed. And again, I remember screaming at night. Never knew where it was coming from. leaving Germany and coming to the United States was really the scene in Bremerhaven, Germany, where we had to board the USS General Hershey. And so kind of what brought back memories of that was one of the film clips showing the last plane out of Afghanistan. And some of the Afghanis running underneath the plane, trying to get on top of the plane, somehow crawl inside. And of course, they didn't make it. So it brought back memories of what I remember as the ship was leaving the dock. We're all on board. The lines had already been hauled away from the dock, and the ship was moving into the waters, still well within the side of the dock. And we're all on the side of the ship, kind of waving goodbye to no one in particular, because there wasn't anyone really wishing us goodbye that I can remember, but I guess everybody just stands at the railing and waves. And suddenly, we see this one man running across the top of the wharf, jumping into the water, and swimming after the boat. We all thought he was just crazy. I don't know if the boat slowed down. It had to have, because eventually it came within distance of the boat to a point where a life raft was thrown out to him with a rope attached. Not a life raft, one of those lifesaver devices. I remember he clung onto it and kind of reeled him in. And as soon as they got him in, I heard that he was put into the brig, where eventually my older brother wound up too. I thought it was a bizarre scene until I realized, I think many years later, what that was really all about. You know, it was really about life and death for this guy. And had he not made it on board, and I don't know what delayed him, that's not really part of the story, because you'll never know. He knew that his life was at an end unless he caught up with the boat and brought over to America. So, now, the scene from Afghanistan with the last plane really memorialized in my memory banks that scene of the boat pulling away from the harbor in Bremerhaven and this poor guy making it just in time. How he didn't drown, I really don't know. How he didn't get caught up in the propellers of the boat, I really don't know. But it was a scene that I'll always remember. Living in Brooklyn in the 50s, which is where my family wound up going to a parochial grammar school. And the neighborhood was Bedford-Stuyvesant. It was kind of a rough neighborhood, if anybody who's really familiar with New York. And so we used to walk to school. It was maybe a 15-minute walk. And it was filled with all kinds of adventures, just walking to school and coming back from school. There were gangs, and chases would take place. And if you got caught, you got beat up, and your lunch money was taken from you. That's about as bad as it got. Maybe a black eye or something like that. But we then graduated to having more serious interactions with one another, meaning kids our own age. Kids that are really outside of the Catholic grammar school that I went to, which was St. Ambrose. And I was taught the art of making carpet guns. And for those of you that perhaps have never heard of the term carpet gun, it's really fairly simple. It involves a couple of things. Number one, the stock of the gun is usually stealing your mother's broom, the broomstick itself, and then cutting it in a particular way, and getting a whole bunch of heavy-duty rubber bands and putting the rubber bands together. And the whole idea of the carpet gun would be that you'd file down one end of the broomstick so that it was relatively flat. And then the rubber band would go under, and there would be a couple of nails holding the rubber bands there. And then the rubber band would be taut all the way across the length of the broomstick. And the trigger would be, of course, your mother's or your neighbor's pins for clothespins. You would break them off in half, and they would basically act as a trigger, and you would put rubber bands around, one half of the clothespin, and basically the release mechanism would be, and you'd use a Coca-Cola bottle cap here, and then the clothespin would go over here, tightly taut, by another set of rubber bands. And the whole idea would be that you would have basically fights with other kids or other gangs, and not out of malice or anything, but kind of fun, that was what we did for fun in Brooklyn. And so where would we get the ammunition from? I'm glad you asked that question. Ammunition was fairly plentiful. If you were living in an apartment building, a rental, all you had to do was pull back the refrigerator, and underneath the refrigerator was linoleum. And all you needed was a box cutter, and you basically create triangle cuts in the linoleum. And you'd come up with triangle bullets. And I would say maybe an inch on each side. And then the way it would work would be that you would pull the rubber band back, put half of the clothespin on it, and then you take the carpet bullets and you put it in between the two rubber bands, and then when you released it, that thing would go shooting off, and it would go pretty far, and if it hit you, it would break your skin or knock out your eye, or possibly worse. And so what would happen would be the gangs would basically face off with one another. They stand maybe 100 yards apart in Tompkins Park in Brooklyn. And the whole idea was that there would be a formation, literally, shoulder to shoulder, and one group would move forward, and the other group would move toward them, and then somebody would yell something out, and then you knew it was time to release your carpet gun on the opposing side. And if that didn't work, and if you didn't really hit anybody, occasionally you'd take the stock of the gun and maybe whack somebody over the head, especially if you ran out of bullets. And then miraculously, the exchange would just stop. Kids would go home, had a good time, got it out of the system, or we would exchange technical information about how to improve our carpet guns. But I kind of felt badly for the landlords because they had no idea that the kids living in these apartment buildings would be pulling back the refrigerator and cutting that. And if that didn't work, then of course you'd get underneath the sink. And underneath the sink would be, carpet as well. But I mean linoleum. So if you ran out of ammunition from underneath the refrigerator, you always had under the sink. You would cut out the stuff. So, that was the way that, we spent our time. And for those that couldn't steal their mother's broomstick, for one reason or another, either mom was cleaning the house or something, a 2x4 would actually be just as good, because the 2x4 would already have a beveled front edge on it, and it would make a hell of a good stick to hit somebody with. So, but usually loaded up your pocket with several pieces of ammunition, because you really didn't want to run out of ammunition, because once you ran out of ammunition, that means you had to use the broomstick or the 2x4. Things could get a little bit ugly, but somehow we survived it. So those were the days in Brooklyn. And anybody who may be watching this or listening to this, if you ever heard of a carpet gun, that's how it was. And of course, after that, for those of us that survived the carpet gun business, we learned how to make zip guns. And if anybody in Brooklyn was missing an antenna from their car, you're looking at a guy like me that, yep, we got your antenna and we used it to make a zip gun. And no, I'm not going to tell you how to do it. Okay? Dangerous. You shoot your eye out, kid. Graduated from parochial grammar school, and of course the next step would be to go to parochial high school. So I wound up going to parochial high school in Harlem in New York. I won't mention the name of the school to protect the guilty and also to protect the innocent. But I liked the school very much. And it was a rather small school. It was an all-boys school. It was run by the Christian Brothers of Ireland. And I thought, you know what? We're a good group of guys. I may want to grow up to be just like one of them. They were mild-mannered for the most part. And for those that weren't mild-mannered, they would just beat the hell out of somebody who misbehaved. And I kind of liked that every now and again. So I remember coming home one day and mentioning to my mother that I'm thinking of joining the Christian Brothers of Ireland because they're a good group of guys and they do good work. And she decided to come to school with me the next day. And I didn't know why, but she went in to see the principal of the school, and basically I heard afterwards, because I wasn't allowed to follow her in, that she apparently threatened to burn down the school if they accepted me into the brotherhood. So anyway, that was the end of my career in being a Christian Brother of Ireland. So it's kind of funny when I think about it now. The brothers there must have thought that she was a real nut job. But she was extremely protective of me, and anyway, that was the end of that. I graduated from that particular high school. Went to New York University. Yes, it's very true. I majored in Elizabethan poetry until I realized sometime thereafter that there was really no career path for anybody majoring in Elizabethan poetry unless you became a professor of some kind, which meant you had to go and master's degree and then probably for a PhD. So after majoring for about 2 years in Elizabethan poetry, it finally dawned on me that I don't think I could make a living doing that. And since I wasn't with the Christian Brothers of Ireland either, how was I going to survive? How was I going to eat? Where was I going to live? And so I decided that Elizabethan poetry really was not for me. So that was the end of that particular major. West 4th Street, Greenwich Village. Take the train from Queens, go into Lower Manhattan to West 4th Street, and spend my days at NYU, skipping classes for the most part, because they were kind of boring. and spending a lot of time in the local pool hall at NYU. There was a particular building there where the pool hall was located. And so there would usually be games, and I would have plenty of change in my pockets. And of course, we'd play for money, and that's how I made my money for food, playing pool in the pool halls instead of being in class. And so that was it. Didn't get much of an education. Elizabethan poetry really didn't cut it. And so the pool halls were kind of fun until I ran out of money, and that was the end of my college career at New York University. And one friend who had one eye, because the other eye was shot out by a bullet. And take the story a little bit further, we were going to start a charter business, boats, commercial business, running between the Virgin Islands and some of the other Caribbean islands. And so we decided that college, while it lasted, was probably fine, but we needed a way of really making a living. So what better way to make a living than being in a charter business? And so we purchased a used sailboat to practice, of course. And my friend with the one eye apparently claimed to be an accomplished sailor. Where exactly got his experience from, a little unclear to me at this stage of my life, but back then it was very clear that he knew everything. And so we would take the sailboat on runs. We would go to Brooklyn, which is where the sailboat was housed, and this one particular trip, which was in February, we were going to do some night sailing. And night sailing was important because, of course, there was no sun out, and we had to travel using the stars and using a compass, to guide our way. So this was right off the Rockways. Yeah, the Rockways, from what I remember. And so we got on a boat, and of course, Brooklyn being rough, my friend with the one eye, who was a seasoned sailor, told us that we need to bring some weapons with us because, there could be sharks in the water. Maybe some other scurrilous characters that, might want to take over our boat. And so I remember a Mauser rifle, M1 rifle, and a couple of other pieces of weapons that were on the board. So we're out there, and this is before nightfall. And so we're target practicing. And apparently we were reported to the police. And so fortunately for us, night fell and cops didn't find us at night. We had no idea where the hell we were either, but that was okay. Then the sun came up the next morning, and we're having a good time finding our way on the water. And next thing we know, the sailboat that we had a very deep rudder on it, and got stuck in a sandbar. And so, we're all college students, very bright, and none of us had any life jackets, because that's what bright kids do. They go out sailing without any protective gear whatsoever. And so we're trying to get the sailboat off of the sandbar, because it was a keel, it was a fixed keel. Couldn't be raised. The keel could not be raised. And so the idea struck us that we should jump overboard. And perhaps try to lift the boat over the sandbar. And so we did that. And I perhaps had one IQ point higher than the rest of my comrades. And I decided, I wasn't going in that water. It's February, it's kind of cold. So I'm going to stay on board and protect the boat while two guys jumped overboard and try to push the boat off the sandbar. So they did, and then the tide changed, and somehow the boat got loose, and the two guys started to swim after the boat, but they didn't make it. And so, by that time, I think the police and the Coast Guard were working with one another to try to find these ruffians that were out there on some sailboat shooting weapons indiscriminately. And so the Coast Guard boat came by not too far from us, and it was a rather big boat. And I'm on the boat, of course, and my two buddies already went underneath the water. Now, of course, I didn't swim, couldn't swim. To this day, I still don't know how to swim. And so the captain of the Coast Guard cutter and one of his mates, they jump overboard from their boat. Well, it kind of pointed that, people in the water, they're drowning. I know it sounds rather cold, but so they dove in, they picked them up, they brought them up, and they sent over a little rowboat for me. And so, with a couple of deckhands. So I got in the rowboat. We got placed onto the Coast Guard ship, and my two friends were dragged up, and they brought us into the fore of the boat where they had these blasters, blowers, hot, warm air coming out, because they were in shock, so they put blankets on us and everything else. And they decided to take us in to the local hospital. I think it was Peninsula Hospital. And so they pull into the dock, and there are a whole bunch of police cars that are apparently waiting to greet us. And the Coast Guard had tied up behind their boat, our sailboat. And of course the weapons were still on board the sailboat that we had. And in the course of coming in to dock, the sailboat, because of its extensively long keel, apparently hit another sandbar, at which point the boat got ripped apart and sank rather quickly. And thank God for us, because when we finally reached the dock where the police apparently were our greeting party, they couldn't find any of the weapons because it was underwater at this point, and they weren't about to go in there and search for them. So I remember being questioned by a couple of detectives, and of course I didn't know anything. Nothing. I've learned that a long time ago, but no, nothing. So they take us to Peninsula Hospital, and we had to go through the waiting room. And so my two buddies had blankets around them. Of course, I didn't need one because I never really got into the water. And remember the nurse coming out, and there were maybe 50 people. I mean, it was a real zoo. And then the nurse said, "Drop your pants." So I'm looking at my two buddies, and they're looking at me, and I figured this is some kind of a joke. And I said to her, "What?" She said, "Drop your pants." I said, "No." And she's kind of like a nurse Cratchit. and type. So apparently we had to get an injection of something or other for, I don't know what the hell it was for. Because we were in the water, and I think some of us got some cuts on metal or something, so we need to get these shots. So everybody in the waiting room is kind of looking at us. So my two buddies dropped the blanket. They dropped their pants. I dropped my pants. We're in our underwear. And she sticks the needle into, our rear ends. Not the same needle, different needle. And after we were treated at the hospital, the detectives wanted to question us some more, which they did. And we had to give them our names and addresses, where we lived. And they asked us about what weapons we might have had. And we denied having any knowledge of any weapons whatsoever. And I was pretty much the end of the story. And that was another career down the drain. Because then, I went into the Army in 1961. For obvious reasons, I couldn't make it as a civilian. No career path at all. Elizabethan poetry had dried up. Oh, we had some strange friends. One of whom always wore a pack of cigarettes rolled up in his t-shirt. And he was more broad than he was tall. And his name was Cliff. And I won't mention his last name, but he and his family ran some kind of real estate operation in Manhattan. And I had some other friends, friends perhaps maybe too endearing a term, other acquaintances, one of whom I found out later apparently was a drug dealer. And he was constantly high, except back then I didn't know what that meant. But I know now, looking back, that he was constantly high on something or other. And that was pretty much it. Some of us were employed by the university itself, and I had a job working for NYU. And I don't exactly remember how I got the job, but my job was basically to take care of people who signed up, adults who signed up for courses at NYU. And so I had my own office and everything else like that. And the woman that was in charge, my job basically day to day was to go to the village and to get her pastries from her favorite French pastry shop and bring it to her. And she was very nice. And so that was pretty much it. I had a bunch of weird friends. We used to hang around the Café Wha all the time. Café Wha, interesting place. This is right around 1959, 1960, early part of 1961. The Café Wha, Greenwich Village, was basically a hangout place. And you would go in there and there would be poetry readings. And you would go in and sit down, order a cup of coffee or something, and sit around. One thing you had to do was wear a black turtleneck shirt, because that's kind of what you did. And that was an indication that you were somewhat intelligent. You had a turtleneck and kind of hung around and nodded your head as the poetry reading took place, and you had to make believe that you really understood, what the reader was actually saying. And by nodding your head, you indicated that you really understood the message, the main message and the subliminal message that was being conveyed to you. I understood more than anybody else in that audience what the poetry readers were actually getting at. Because, you had to be deep and you had to be sensitive. And I had all those qualities, deep, sensitivity. And it really, you could pretend to really be smart, and no one would know the difference. And of course, I had no idea what the hell the readers were talking about, because they wrote their own poetry. They didn't read anybody else's poetry. They wrote their own stuff and read their own stuff, and be a lot of applause and that kind of stuff. So it was very interesting, and really, really good people, but I'm not sure any of them had a real job of any kind. And I went to the Café Wha for quite a number of years, skipping classes, of course, and really enjoying, the bohemian life in Greenwich Village. And that was pretty much it, except for the manager of the Café Wha. Because when I got older, got married, and we had to move from Queens to Rockland County, I needed to hire some movers. So I contacted a moving company. I forgot the name of it. But lo and behold, representative from the moving company shows up at the apartment in Glen Oaks, where my wife and I were living at the time. And turned out he was the manager of the Café Wha. I'm looking at him, and he's looking at me, and we both kind of, do we know one another? Yeah, Café Wha, man, that was it. It was kind of bizarre. Anyway, nice guy. So that whole episode of 1959, 1960, early part of 1961, Café Wha, as you could probably imagine and predict, it dried up pretty quickly. There was no future path going forward. And so I decided, since Elizabethan poetry didn't work for me, and I could not become a Christian Brothers of Ireland person, what else am I going to do? Well, join the Army, of course. And what would I do in the Army? Well, hell, if you're going to do that, you might as well go for all of it. So I volunteered with the paratrooper group. And so became a member of the 82nd Airborne Division, sent to Fort Benning in Georgia, where we were stationed. And after paratrooper training, stationed at Fort Bragg. And then we would have exercises, because we were basically always on call. The 82nd Airborne was one of those outfits that if anything broke out anywhere on an international basis, that we would be the ones that would go there. And so we would have exercises that went on for weeks and weeks. And some of the groups that we dealt with were, at one point, French Foreign Legion, members of the regular Army, U.S. Army, also the 101st Airborne. We would have joint operations together. And on one of these exercises, I think it might have been in Spartanburg, somewhere, North Carolina and South Carolina area, I ran into Jimi Hendrix. I found out later, who he really was. I had a short conversation with him. Nothing really impressive one way or the other. But, when I found out later just how famous Jimi Hendrix was, I said, wow, I actually met this guy. But I really didn't know who he was at the time, other than the fact that he had an interest in guitars, a real deep interest, and I had kind of a passing interest. Oh, yeah, so it was Jimi Hendrix, and he had a couple of buddies with him at the time, and actually what happened was the group that I was with, we were charged with protecting a particular piece of property, And so the 101st, some of the guys in the 101st were coming through, and they were the enemy, so to speak. That was part of the training. So we took them prisoners. And so we started to have a conversation. And so at one level, they were prisoners, but on the other level, we were kind of exchanging stories with one another, because you didn't really get to meet a lot of, folks from the 101st. They were called the Screaming Eagles, and we were all-American, 82nd Airborne. And so, in speaking with some of his buddies, and again, knowing a little bit about Jimi Hendrix, but really not a lot, apparently he, I found out from him that the way he got into the Army, because he didn't really have a good fit with the Army way of life, there was an incident apparently with a vehicle, and didn't belong to him, but somehow he came in possession of the vehicle. And so the judge finally said to him, look, you have a choice. You could either sign up for 3 years or jail time. So he decided, I'm going to sign up and might as well go for the 101st Airborne. So got a conversation with some of his buddies and found out that he wasn't exactly a top soldier. He'd fall asleep on guard duty, that kind of stuff. So I found out much later, because I would then track a little bit about what he did. I think he lasted maybe a year and a half in the Army. Yeah, he didn't put in his full 3 years. And on one of his last jumps, I think he had the same number of jumps as I did, 26. He twisted his ankle or something. And that was an opportunity at that point to get an honorable discharge out of the service for him. And that became a pretty good reason, to get out of the service. I'm not speaking for him, but I think the 101st Airborne people were happy with that kind of a solution, and he went on and I think pursued his career. And I went on and pursued whatever. So spent the rest of my time with the 82nd Airborne. Had a couple of assignments, in the Army, just like most other Army people did. But then we got into 1962, and it was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And prior to October 62, there was a lot of weird stuff going on. So in preparation for invading Cuba, we were put onto an airfield in Florida. I won't mention the name of the airfield. It's immaterial. But we were all strapped in with a lot of heavy gear, parachutes, machine guns strapped to us. We're sitting under the wings of a couple of C-130s, C-119s, getting ready to go to Cuba. And normally, the orders would be read once you're inside the plane. And a plane has gone up in the air, except this time. It didn't really work that way. So we received orders. We were told where we're going to go. And we were advised that the fighting was going to be fierce, and that there would really be no prisoners that we could take. And so, coming out of a parochial grammar school, parochial high school, that really did not sit very well with me. I understood very well what we were being told, and quite frankly, I didn't know what I would do at the time. And thank God I didn't have to do anything, because after spending about 48 hours, I think it was close to 48 hours, sitting in this on the airfield underneath the wings of a C-130s, the assault on Cuba was called off, and found out later that these poor bastards who'd been trained by us and by some of the Special Forces folks at Fort Bragg, Cubans, they did not get the support that they were supposed to get. We were going to be part of the support. We were going to be dropped into Cuba. And some of us had been in Cuba before, preparing the locals and sort of gathering intelligence. And the people that stormed the beaches of Cuba, a lot of them got killed, a lot of them got captured, and they didn't get the support that I think they were promised. And anyway, that was the end of that particular set of experiences. It was very, very sad, and as far as I'll go with that. We had aboard some planes at Pope Air Force Base, which was located just outside of Fort Bragg. There were several thousand of us, and we're trying to figure out where the hell were we being taken to now. And it turned out that we were being shipped to Mississippi, just outside of Oxford, Mississippi. And it was at the time where James Meredith was going to enter the university, and he was prevented, I think, from going in and registering. And so federal troops were sent in by order of President Kennedy. And so we flew in and camped out basically in the woods, tents being set up. And our job was to ensure that James Meredith got safe passage into the university, was able to register. And so we had weapons, and the weapons, we had live ammunition loaded in the weapons, although I couldn't see using them until we actually hit the crowds that were there chanting and carrying on. A pretty ugly sight. And I remember some of the guys that were with me were from the South, and obviously I was from New York, the North. Very different backgrounds, and they had different points of view than I did, and some of the other guys that I was with. And so I'll get to the part where we're escorting James Meredith, up the steps into the university, and a couple of the locals, got a hold of some of us and got into some fist fights, getting some bruises on my face. But we eventually got James Meredith in, and he got registered. And that took place, but I remember being shocked, taken aback by how strongly people held views as to whether he should be in that university or shouldn't be in that university. And it was, I don't think I've ever been exposed to anything like that before. And it was really it's an educational process. It was scary at times. Well, I remember people, I think, regarding gypsies, Jews as a kind of people at a subhuman level. They weren't humans. You had to, you had to demonize them in order to do what you did to them. And maybe in that sense, it was really no different. And the experience is, just outside of Oxford, Mississippi. The blacks had to be somewhat dehumanized, I think, to be treated the way that they were. So yeah, interesting point. I guess there's not that much of a difference. But it was still frightening to see, again, how strongly people held their beliefs to a point where there was physical confrontation. They were willing, to do whatever they needed to do